Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Silicon Revival. Today with us, Professor Noel Johnson. Of so, Before we start, I want to briefly introduce you to our audience. Professor Noel Johnson is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's also a research fellow at the Mercatus Center and a member at the Center for the Study of Public Choice. Professor, for the part one, I had some questions related to your field and your career. What initially drew you to economic history and institutional economics?
So I think economic history is really interesting because I'm interested in some big questions about economic development and how institutions evolve and when they're helpful or they're not helpful for human flourishing. And the simple fact is that most of the variation in institutions exists in the past, right? We have a lot of data available in the present, but there are many more creative forms of institutions that existed in the past, that we can try to use either as natural experiments or as descriptive examples to try to figure out how to do better economic theory today and also how to think about the past in a better way. And I guess on a more personal level, I began as in studying history, and then I was disappointed that within history departments today at least American universities, and I know European universities as well, it's very difficult to do quantitative empirical history. And so I ended up studying in an economics department under people like Douglas North and John Nye to do economic history with them. And so that's kind of how I came in through it in a roundabout way. Yeah.
Uh, Got it. And my next question: big papers can take years, and your motivation often shrinks over time. So, what do you do when a project stalls? Do you change the question, change the data, or change the item? And can you give a concrete example?
Well, I just asked Claude Code to help me do it. I'm just kidding.
Right.
So, well, it's a good point. Some projects take a lot longer than others, and they can become a bit of a struggle, right? To keep interest in it. I personally enjoy having co-authors to work with, right? And that often keeps things fresh. But really though, it's I'm not the quickest worker in the world, right? And so I don't mind having a project that I work on, for a few months, and then I can put it aside for a few months, and then come back around to it. I think one thing that I've become better at as I've become older is learning to let projects go, when they're no longer going to work, right? So this is something. I mean, when I was younger, I also needed to make them work, right? Because I had to get tenure, right? And things like this. And I think all young people in academia face that sort of pressure, which is not ideal. But at some point, we all try to become better at realizing, well, this idea was maybe not as good as I thought it was initially. I should just let it become what it's going to be, not push it to become like the best paper in the world, but maybe publish it in a lower level journal and let it go. But then sometimes I'm surprised and I start a project that I don't think is going to necessarily be the best one in the world, and things just fall into place. So one of the papers that we'll talk about, I think last, the one on mapping the market for ideas that I mentioned that we agreed we'd talk about, that's an example of the latter, where it was just some ideas I was playing with, and then all of a sudden things started snapping together, in a way that was unexpected. But yeah.
Oh, got it. And my next question, how does slavery affect economics? Yeah,
What do you mean? I
slavery.
like as
Yeah,
so
slavery, like selling. people.
Are you talking about PhD students? Are you talking about the history of slavery or what?
Like yeah, history related. Like
Okay, so I don't really study slavery directly. I teach U.S. economic history to PhD students, where we have to talk about slavery, of course, right? The A lot of the big work in economic history, on slavery, was taking place in the late '60s and or in the '70s, and there's been a little bit of revival of it, but not a huge amount. The main people were Stanley Engerman and Bob Fogel, of course. And Bob Fogel won the Nobel Prize in economics for partly for that work eventually. Uh, I mean, when I teach it, especially to undergraduates, the way I teach the lessons that we take from the economic history of slavery in the United States is that one of the things that economic historians, not myself but others, eventually decided was probably correct was that slave agriculture was, if anything, more efficient than non-slave agriculture in the North. So the way that the South was doing agriculture using slaves was, if anything, as efficient, as the way agriculture was done in the North. And a lot of people find that very disconcerting because they want economic efficiency to be equivalent to morality, right? But one of the big lessons I think we can take from what we've learned from slavery in the U.S. South is that those two things are not equivalent, right? That which is economically efficient need not be morally good, right? And those are different types of questions to think about. So that's one way, that slavery has entered. But there are many other really interesting reasons, sorry, interesting things to think about with slavery, like the extent to which the classical civilizations like ancient Greece depended on slaves, right? To have their society function. That's also always something that I find people who don't study history find surprising, right? When they talk about democracy, for example, in ancient Athens, how very different that is from our notion of liberal democracy, today, whereas the democracy was very narrow, right? In ancient Athens, and its survival depended on a whole lower class of slaves, right? That did a lot of the production for them. So those are two ways, that slavery has entered in, yeah, to the economic history discourse.
got it. And my next question, like, do you think the larger the area, the better the economy? Because you know, if the country, I mean, area of the country is kind of larger, they
Mhm.
can have like they can create different workplaces. So by doing that, they can also like there is also some benefits for their economy state. So so but like countries like Switzerland, despite having like small area, their economy is like way better than some larger countries than Switzerland. So what do you
Yeah.
think?
So there's a few things there to unpack. The Switzerland, well, we'll come to the Switzerland thing eventually. Switzerland's complicated. My wife is Swiss, right? So I've thought about this a little bit. The First of all, they have to think of what do we mean by area? Like the larger,
Yes.
the larger the country. So I can think of two ways of defining that. One is jurisdictional, like just the extent to which the borders of that polity extend,
Uh-huh.
right? Um, well, actually, three ways. Another way to think about it is geographic, right? Like what is your landmass, that you're dealing with. So here we can start talking about Jared Diamond things like what is the size of the longitudinal axis, of your continent, and how that depends on how that matters for technology transfer. Or we can dig into any of these if you want. Things like endogenous growth theory, Romer, where, the larger, your contiguous landmass the more people you have who have ideas, and in a world where ideas are non-rival, like in consumption, then big is going to win, right? Because you have a whole bunch of people with some very small probability of having a good idea. As soon as one of them has a good idea, everybody can have it, right? Which means that Australia is probably going to lose, right? Because they just have a limited amount of people in there, but Eurasia is going to win, right? Because there's just more. There's a beautiful paper by Michael Kramer, on Malthusian economics and endogenous growth theory that investigates that. Another way we could think about size is market access, right? So just, how linked in are you to
Mm-hmm.
trade networks? Meaning that, and so this will come up again in the mapping market for ideas paper that we mentioned to each other before the podcast. So market access is basically the inverse distance weighted sum of the populations of all the places around you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so all those populations, those are markets. They're markets that you can sell your goods to, and they're also markets that you can hire people from, like
Mm-hmm.
inputs from, right? And so that notion of size, like, what's the extent of the market you're embedded in? That's definitely a good thing, right? That's going to help you, like the larger that is. And so I think all three of those notions of size, like the size of your polity, the size of your geographic extent, the size of the markets, that you can trade with, they're somewhat independent things, not completely, but somewhat, and they all matter. And I think they all, well, I think two of them unambiguously are positive for growth, right? That is the larger your landmass, the geographic one, and the larger your market access, that's going to be better for your economic development. The size of the polity, that's a little bit more complicated because there could be issues with institutional quality and jurisdictional competition driving institutional quality. So one of the better examples of this might be work that my colleague he just moved to another university, but Mark Koyama, has done, looking at the size of the Chinese polity, like historically, compared to the fragmented state system in Europe, and
Mm-hmm.
how the fragmented state system probably drove higher institutional quality across Europe, whereas in China there wasn't that same pressure. And the reason why that polity was bigger in China, for various complicated reasons having to do with the steppe and Mongols invading and things like this, it tended to be larger, as a unit. But that's still an open question, right? So it's a good question. Depends on how we define it, right? And yeah, so it's good. Oh, in Switzerland, why are they so rich? I don't know. they they have the mountains, right? Which protected them from a lot of things. They
Uh-huh.
also did a lot of early one of their biggest exports, in the medieval period was mercenaries, right? And that brought in a lot of bullion, a lot of gold, silver, and also may have facilitated early banking. But ultimately, I think their wealth really started with like the chemical industry and things like this in the 19th century. So that's a very good question. Switzerland is weird, right?
Uh-huh.
There are four languages spoken, three big ones, right? French, Italian, German, and then Romansh, which they speak in the mountains, and uh, and they managed to have a fairly cohesive culture, right? And a fairly well functioning one, despite this heterogeneity with the ethno-linguistic fractionalization and so forth. So it's a good question about Switzerland. Yeah.
Uh-huh. All right, got it. And my next question: uh, why did technological growth begin around 1800 in Britain and a few Western nations instead of China or the Islamic world, which were earlier technological leaders?
That's the biggest question in all of economic history, right? And so I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer to it, right? There are lots of competing theories, about what. So what you're talking about is the Industrial Revolution,
Mhm.
right? And And so the Industrial Revolution begins in, I believe, like two industries in England, basically textiles and road building infrastructure. Is where it first starts showing up in the national income accounts. And why, it does that is an interesting question. So I think it's an interesting question why it starts in England as opposed to, say, the Low Countries, the Netherlands, right? Or even France, right? Uh, and then the other question that you brought up, which I think is an even more difficult one to answer, is why did it not start and say the Yangtze River Valley, like in China, instead of happening in Europe? I think some of this can be chalked up to especially the one within Europe, why England and not, say, the Netherlands. I think we can attribute part of that to luck, like, or just happenstance, right? That England happened to have the conditions first, but the Low Countries were very close, right? To having that as well. Um, I think that uh, I'm a big believer in Robert Allen's work on basically arguing that in England, the cost of labor relative to energy and other inputs was relatively high. And so this generated incentives to adopt labor saving technology in England more so than in places like France or the Low Countries or in Asia as well, right? Listen, actually, this Robert Allen's story, his story works for all of your question. Actually, I think in a very rather elegant way. So basically, what it doesn't explain is why inventive activity took place and like just occurred. What it explains is adoption of inventions once they're in place, right? Those are separate processes. Like, and it could do both, but I don't think it did, right? I think it definitely explains, why you would want to, say, adopt steam power more quickly in England, because you have relatively cheap energy, meaning that they had a lot of wood, they had a lot of peat, and they had a lot of coal. Like, and so and that was very cheap relative to labor. And so it made sense to substitute machines for the workers, right? There. Whereas it just didn't make sense. It's the same reason that you go to one might go to a developing country, and or let's say you're in the United States and you drive down the highway and you see people working on the roads, like you're building a highway or something, and they're using all these big expensive machines to do it, right? Like there's a machine that's crushing the rocks and one that's heating the stuff up and laying it and flattening out the road and so forth. But then you can go to a developing country, that has much lower wealth, and there will be many more workers working with hand tools, breaking things up and building the road without the heavy capital, the machinery and so forth. And one might initially just say, well, this is because they're backwards, the developing country, but that need not be the case. Right. In fact, it's probably the case that labor is just a lot cheaper relative to capital in the developing country. And so this is a perfectly reasonable and rational way to do production. Right. But it might not be leading to the same productivity ultimately, right? That you want it to. And so Bob Allen's story about the Industrial Revolution is very much that relative price story, right? Now there's one can always push it back more and more layers. Like, so why were the relative prices that way in England, right? As opposed to in other places. But then that's another, we could dig into that, right? But that would be one of the leading candidates. And then of course, on the side of like why the inventive activity was happening in the first place, I'm a big Joel Mokyr fan, so Joel Mokyr just won the Nobel Prize, I think this last year, yes, and he argues that useful knowledge, emerged, through this culture, of ideas, right? That was a pan-European thing that developed, over the course of the late medieval and the early modern period, which again, I keep on referencing it, but we may or may not get to it. But if we talk about that mapping the market for ideas paper eventually, that's very much a Mokyr style paper that's talking about the development of that market for ideas and the rise of useful knowledge. And so I think that plays a role. Although one last thing to say about the causes of the Industrial Revolution or the Great Divergence, as we can also call it, around 1800. We probably will never know exactly why, right, it occurred, because it's over identified in the sense that we have too many explanations and probably not enough variation in the data, excuse me, to distinguish
Right.
between these explanations. Um, but that's okay, right? We can still have multi-causal explanations for things and learn, about the present as well. Yeah.
Oh God. And my next question: do you think uh, like economic miracle of the Nazi Germany is real stuff or like kind of made up or like fake? To
Can you say that?
do you
Can you
think
say
like
that?
the economic miracle of the Nazi Germany is the real stuff or like the fake? Uh,
The economic miracle of the Nazi Germany. I'm not sure I know what that is. So are you talking about after World War II, the German
After World
growth
War One,
experience?
1930s, like when they kind of lost the World War One and they kind of again regained their power very quickly, and like in economies also.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I would call that an economic miracle because, I mean, so this is way outside of my subfield, but the person who I would rely on this is Adam Tooze,
Hmm.
Tooze, like, and the work he's done. And from my gathering, from what he talks about, the Germans were by no means an economic miracle when they started World War II. In fact, they probably were less mechanized and in worse economic shape than people often attribute, like just in the popular like telling of the whole like story. And you know, they had very bad macroeconomic experience, right? During the 1920s and 30s, right? And so, um, yeah. I mean, they experienced hyperinflation, and they came out of that, right? And I don't think they were necessarily what I would characterize as an economic miracle. Yeah. So if
Hmm.
that's your question, but take that with a grain of salt. I'm a guy who thinks about the period 1300 to like 1900.
Hmm.
You
All right.
so I don't but that's from my reading of popular books that almost anybody would be reading. That's my take, on that question. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. And all right, my last question for the part one. How did the end of Silk Road affect the global economy? Which countries won from that, and which countries lost?
That's the end of what?
Silk Road.
Oh, the Silk Road. uh Again, this is like far outside of my expertise. So I probably would pass on that question, right? Because I've done work on Europe, I've done work on India, and I've done work on the Middle East, but I've done very little work,
All right.
on the places that were heavily tied, right?
Hmm.
To the Silk Road network. So I'm not going to speculate on that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Professor. Uh,
Although with my apologies, because I know the title of this podcast is the Silk Road podcast.
all right.
Yeah.
So moving on, I had some questions for the part two, like for your research paper that is called "The Economic Impact of the Black Death." So
Mhm.
I had a few questions. So my first question: why did workers get higher pay after the plague, even though the overall economy got worse?
Yeah. So it's interesting. There are two stories going on here, at least, with the Black Death. So, for your listeners, the Black Death was between 1347 and 1352 in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It entered from Messina in the Mediterranean. And before that, it was coming in from the Crimean port of Kaffa. So, probably came along the Silk Road, right? Into Europe. We have embarrassingly little information
Uh-huh.
on the impact of the Black Death in places like China. I've asked scholars who are experts in this, and they claim that the numbers are just not there, right? To make any predictions. And so I'll trust them on that. But in Europe, we have a lot more data. So the Black Death was a pandemic that's based on a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and in the version that came into Europe was known as the bubonic plague.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you're still there. You froze for a second. You can still hear me?
Like, yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I
Good.
can, I can, I
Was
can.
Okay, good, good, good. So this is the bubonic plague that comes in, and between 1347 and 52, it spreads across cities in Europe, and these cities experience mortality rates that range from close to zero, like in Milan, to extremely high, like 80%, something like this. And places like I think Winchester got hit very, very hard. I'd have to double check the number, right, in England. So and so there's a certain amount of randomness, to these mortality rates,
Mm-hmm.
that the Black Death is bringing with it. And so so this is a huge shock to Europe. And then, sorry, what was your specific question again that you had about it?
I asked, like, why did workers get higher pay after the
Right,
plague?
right. Good. Okay, good. So we have this shock. On average, across Europe, during this period, you're losing 40% of the population or so. Okay. And what this means is that the uh, the value of labor relative to land is going high, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have fewer workers, but you have the same amount of land. In fact, you probably have even more land, right? Because there's fewer people, on it. So there's more open land. And so this means that in terms of inputs to production, we're now paying our labor input more than we are the other major input, which is land, right? During this period, capital is a relatively small component, right? Of the production process, at this point. And so initially, this is not the case because initially, if you imagine what happens if in your town die, within like a few months, like all hell breaks loose, right? Like production breaks down, like the world is basically ending for everybody, right? For a little while. And, for the years immediately following the initial impact of the Black Death, that is what occurred. Like markets just broke down, crops were left to rot in the fields, things, and so during that period, wages did not go up, because just like everything broke down, the economy just wasn't working right. But relatively quickly, like 5, 10 years, after the initial impact, we see the sustained rise in wages. And the more appropriate way to say that there's a very large rise in the price of labor relative to land. Okay. And this is because because labor is mobile, this is across regions in Europe, right? And it persists for about 200 years, okay, before it comes back down, right? And so, one way of thinking about this is that it took about 200 years for Europe to recover demographically,
Uh-huh.
from the Black Death shock, right? And so it wasn't until about 1550 or so, right? That you have the wages going back down. So in a way, this is a uh, this this is a somewhat counterintuitive thing for a lot of people. The Black Death was horrible, in the sense that a lot of people died, but if you survived, right, then you and your ancestors it probably were doing better if you were a worker, right? And this had profound implications for a lot of things, like for example, um, if you were a noble, right, a lot more of your wealth is tied up in land, which is going down in value. Whereas if you're a serf, or a worker, a lot more of your wealth is tied up in your labor, right? Which is going up in value. So we're changing the relative bargaining power of the elites relative to the non-elites, when this demographic
Ah,
shock,
yeah.
is hitting. And so this is going to have implications for feudal institutions and their survival. It's going to have implications probably for guild institutions and their survival across Europe. And it's also going to lead to something called the second serfdom in Eastern Europe,
Mm-hmm.
which is where basically you had this pressure demographically where the non elites were putting pressure on the elites to get more freedom and more rights. But the elites in Eastern Europe basically doubled down with a military force to suppress these movements and impose what's known as the second serfdom, which was a very repressive version of feudalism, that emerged right in that part of Europe, compared to say England or France, like where you see feudal forms changing. Like for example, the agricultural contracting system known as sharecropping, in French is called métayage, is gradually disappearing in the aftermath of the Black Death because it had relatively poor terms for the workers relative to the owners of the land, like for that. So, so that's the answer to your question, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. So about this, like, why it kind of didn't spread to the Asia, for example, like kind of
Mm.
only Europe. It's only kind of, I guess, like uh, countries in Asia kind of cut the strait, I guess. Like there was maybe there was like kind of trading between countries, and they kind of cut it after that. After they heard that there is like kind of some kind of virus there spreading. So and also like I guess maybe I mean this is my assumption like about cleanliness. Like there is kind of I don't know whether it's fact or kind of like fake stuff. Like Europe kind of not very good at like in cleanliness, so maybe this could have been the reason, why it's kind of so like why it's kind of bombarded there. So yeah, kind of gave my
Oh,
opinion.
well, yeah, I'm not sure about the. Again, I'm not an expert in Asia, so I just ask other people who are experts, like Bin Ma and like people like this. But and my co-author on a lot of the Black Death work I've done on Europe is Mark Koyama, and he knows a lot more about Asia. You should probably consider interviewing him at some point. He would have a lot to say about your Silk Road question, probably as well. Like the so with cleanliness, one thing I can say about the European context, I've done a lot of work looking at Jewish communities as well, and sometimes and some of that work has been about the impact of the Black Death on Jewish communities. And usually that's about persecution, like, because Jews were blamed by Christians for the Black Death because nobody understood the epidemiology, the science, of what it was. And so it was often they generated scapegoats, the Christians, and Jews were a natural scapegoat historically in Western Europe, right?
Mhm.
But a question that's come up in our research is, were did Jews practice more cleanly habits like bathing and things like this? Or were they more isolated so they would be less subject to the Black Death mortality? And we don't find any evidence for that at all.
Mhm.
It was the only evidence we do see is that quarantine starts to emerge in well, we know like one reason why the Ottomans, didn't have it as bad is because they would just shut the gates of cities, right?
Mhm.
Like when the disease was taking place, and quarantine can be an effective way to avoid, right? Like the plague, right? It's like why we shut everything down in COVID, right? And so forth, right?
Mhm.
Like in Europe, I believe in Milan they imposed a quarantine during the main 1347 to 52 event. I'd have to double check that. But really, it wasn't until later recurrences of the plague that you started seeing cities quarantining on a more regular basis. And so that was not happening in Europe. I don't have any idea if that was happening in Asia. My understanding from talking to other people who know more than I do, I don't know if it's that they just didn't feel like having the conversation with me, but they just tell me the data don't exist. That the records weren't kept, right? Like how many people may have died or not, which speaks to low state capacity, which I find odd. But that's what I've heard, right? The only other place where, aside from Europe, where we seem to have fairly good records on mortality is Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
and there the story is slightly a slightly separate one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor. And my next question, why did cities on rivers and oceans bounce back quickly while other towns stayed small?
Good. So one of the reasons we were interested in looking at the Black Death, and what we did, my co-authors here were Mark Koyama and Remy Yedwab. We were interested in the city level mortality rates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so our story is very much like an urban economic story. And what we established in our research is that at the city level, the mortality rates from the Black Death appear to be random.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like it's you could have the Black Death was definitely traveling along trade networks, but when it reached a city, for various reasons, it was the it's hard to find any correlation between the mortality rate at the city level and anything we can observe. Okay, and so this makes a nice natural experiment for us for questions like why are cities where they are? And
Mm-hmm.
so in urban economics, there are two major theories about why people agglomerate, that is, why cities emerge, right? In
Mm-hmm.
different places. The first one is that there's some sort of geographic amenity, right? Which is just a fancy way of saying there's like a river, right? You're on the ocean where you can have ships land. It's like some natural port or something like this. You're not on a mountain where it's hard to grow food, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
something like that, or your soil is fertile. So we see people tend to agglomerate in those locations, right?
Uh-huh.
If we wanted to, we could extend that to like Roman roads and intersections, right? Because that's existing geographic amenities. The second theory about why people go where they go, right, is that it's to put it in this kind of like a jokey kind of way, people are where they are because that's where all the people are, right? People tend to go where there are other people because that makes them more productive. Another way of saying that is that there are increasing returns to being around other people, right? I
Mm-hmm.
have an idea, I can share it with you. I have one set of skills, you have another, they might be complementary to each other. There are lots of reasons why this might be the case, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, both of these theories can be true at the same time, but we can also try to distinguish between which is more powerful and at different times and places by looking for a natural experiment. And the way these natural experiments have often been set up in the literature is you try to look for some disaster, right? That is uh, eliminating, which is a horrible way of saying a killing, a whole bunch of people, right, in a
Mm-hmm.
location. And so if you just had like, like what's that movie, the Marvel movie where Thanos or whatever snaps his fingers, right? And like half the
And game.
population just yeah, exactly. So like half the population moves, like disappears. That's the natural experiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you lost, you just cleanly remove that many people. If the theory that people are where they are because that's where all the people are, if that's the one that's true, then if I remove, like, say, 70% of the people from that location,
Mm-hmm.
then there's no reason for people to go back, right?
Uh-huh.
Because there's no longer people there. But if the correct theory is that people are located in places because there are amenities, like geographically fixed things like a river or a Roman road intersection or something like this, then even if you remove 70% of the people, that amenity is still there. And so
Mm-hmm.
we'd expect people to go back, right? And so that place would recover like its population. Whereas if it was the increasing return story, the place would not recover its population.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're seeing in our story is a little bit of both, actually, right? We're seeing that the cities that did not have amenities like the river, or the coast or something, or being close to the Roman road, something like this, um, the ones that didn't have that were not recovering very quickly, whereas the ones that did were recovering more quickly, right?
Mhm.
And so this is suggesting that both the increasing returns and the urban amenity stories are correct, right? And
Mhm.
they explain to some extent the structure of the urban recovery after the Black Death, right?
Mhm.
And so you have, for example, a much larger proportion of the European population living in proximity to a river, you know, 200 years after the Black Death relative to 50 years before, right? And that's because those cities just grew so much more quickly. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
My next question about your this research paper. Why did the plague set peasants free in Western Europe but trap them in Eastern Europe?
And that one I think I mentioned as much as I have to say about it, right? So the second serfdom, which is what you're referring to, I talked about a little bit earlier. So basically, across all of Europe, East and West, the plague is causing the price of labor relative to land to go up, right? Which is increasing the political bargaining power of workers relative to elites. In Eastern Europe, because of the nature of their politics and the way that it was structured, they were able to organize to suppress the peasants so they could not revolt as easily and gain
Mhm.
power. And that was the second serfdom. And in most of Western Europe, this was not the case.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, and so there, for various reasons, including labor mobility, right? The like inability to organize the elites, right? In the same way, uh, different levels of state capacity. The there the workers were better able to bargain, and you see this reflected uh, in more or less the beginning of the decline of the feudal system, right? Like that
Mhm.
existed in Western Europe. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So, and my last question for this for your research paper, you mentioned that uh, Christians like kind of blamed Jewish people, right?
Mhm.
So, why were towns less likely to attack Jewish communities if they relied on them for banking and trade?
Right. So this is a paper that Remy, Mark, and I published in the Journal of Economic Growth a few years back. And so, but it's also mentioned in the survey article in the Journal of Economic Literature that we're talking about right now. Um, so what we found there was somewhat surprising to us. What we expected was that the higher the mortality rate in the city, the higher the probability would be that a Jewish community would be persecuted in that city,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but what we found was a gradient that was very smooth and the opposite, right? That basically showed that, well, first of all, anybody who has the Black Death has a higher probability of killing their Jewish community, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's highest for lowest mortality rates. And then as the mortality rate in the city goes higher and higher and higher, the probability of persecuting the Jewish community goes lower and lower. And we found this to be even stronger if there was clear evidence in the historical records that Jews were lending money
Mm-hmm.
in the town, or if Jews were acting as merchants for long distance trade. And so the argument that the hypothesis that we developed was that what we're observing is that if you're hit by this devastating disease, uh, you have to rebuild your town. And if you want to rebuild your town, you don't want to kick out or kill the people who can lend you money, like that you could
Mm-hmm.
use to invest in capital, right? Or the people who are facilitating your trade, with other locations.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be consistent with the record. Another thing that we found in that work was that if there were substitutes for Jewish money lending. So, for example, if there was if there was evidence of Italian money lenders, like being in the same area in the same city, then the Jews were more likely to be killed, right? Because they didn't have a monopoly, right?
Mm-hmm.
On this credit, like lending and so forth, and so that was what we found with that story. Although to be clear, the Black Death was a disaster for Jews in Europe. Like the
Mm-hmm.
just the raw probability, the raw baseline probability that you would be killed or expelled as a Jew between 1347 and 1352 went up dramatically. But just given that, the higher the probability rate, like for a given city, that very high probability was lowered. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like depending on that gradient. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Got it, Professor. Thank you. And for moving on, for part three, I prepared some questions about your research paper that is called Mapping the Market for Ideas in Europe, 1450 to 1650, title Embeddings Approach. So, my first question is related to the big picture question. When book publishing exploded across Europe in the 15th and 16th, did local cities start specializing in their own unique topics, or did they all start printing similar mainstream ideas?
Yeah, so this paper. The first thing to know for your audience is that the printing press,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably one of the biggest technological innovations ever, right? But definitely one of the biggest technological innovations within media, like information technology, ever. It emerged as a unique invention around 1450,
Mm-hmm.
okay, in Europe. Okay. And it began, the first city to have it was Mainz, where Gutenberg, put it together. And in the early years, it goes from about having publishing about 3,000 Latin books a decade to printing tens of thousands of books, a decade. So, what we have is a database that's been collected by historians over a long period of time called the Universal Short Title Catalog, the USTC, that is a database of the titles of these
Mm-hmm.
books, of which there are about 800,000 printed between 1450 and 1650.
Mm-hmm.
And these titles contain a lot of information about the content in the books, right? The titles are in Latin, German, French, Dutch, all the languages across Europe. And you can think of them as being like basically like tweets, right? They're on the order of that size, like where they're long enough that you can often infer what the content of the book is from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we take Harvey's treatises on blood, right? Like where it's the circulation of blood in the body, one of the early scientific revolution books, where he was like dissecting cadavers to try to figure out how the blood system worked and so forth. His title will include words, like blood and circulation, right? And dissection and things like that, right? Which you can easily associate, with that kind of work. Okay. So we have those titles. And then what we do is, and my co-author on this paper is Alexander Taylor, one of my former PhD students, who's now a professor at the University of Evansville. We take these titles and we turn them into embeddings. And so, any of you who have used a large language model, which I'm pretty sure is most of you, right? Like ChatGPT or Claude or
Yeah.
something like this, whenever you type something into that model, the first thing the model does is it converts your words that you type into embeddings. And so if I type in the word dog, right, to the prompt, dog is going to have a 200 dimensional vector associated with it that puts it in this 200 dimensional space, right? And if I type in cat, it's going to have a separate 200 dimensional vector that lives in some other part of this 200 dimensional space. And the way the embeddings are generated, um, the words that are closer to each other in terms of where they appear in documents, like are going to be also closer to each other in the embedding space. So for example, dog is going to be closer to puppy than it will be to cat, right?
Uh-huh.
And dog and cat will be closer to dog than dog is to washing machine, right? In there, right? And so the embeddings make possible all the things that the large language models are doing because that's like the language they speak, right? And we do this basically. We train our own embeddings for all the words and all the different languages across all these titles of the USTC. And then we aggregate them, which is something that you're mathematically allowed to do up to the title level. So we get title level embeddings. And so when we do this, a title that is like Harvey's work on blood circulation will be closer to a work, another work on science, like Tycho Brahe's work on astronomy, than it will be to a funeral oration for a king, or a book on how to fight wars, right? And so basically, we create a database of
Mm-hmm.
title embeddings that allows us to position all these different books that are being published in Europe between 1450 and 1650 in this 200 dimensional space where books that are more similar in content will be closer together in that space.
Uh,
And then this lets us then characterize the print, the nature of the print that's coming out of cities over time. And we can do things like say how much variety in topics is being printed in the city, how close do the topics printed in the city match the overall topics of like what's being printed in Europe, right? And that kind of thing. And so then the question we ask in the paper is, as a city in Europe between 1450 and 1650 becomes more connected to broader markets, what happens to their print content?
mhm.
Okay. And basically, it's what happens is kind of what you just said, right? As the market for your books that you're printing in, say, Mainz or in Frankfurt or London becomes big. I should use London because we're kicking England out because it's not very useful. But with Paris, right? Like the as your market becomes larger for your books, you end up printing a wider. Also, two things happen. First, you print a wider variety of topics in your city, but you also print a variety that's closer to the variety printed at the European average than what you were doing before. So a good analogy. So this is basically a result that's been established by a theoretical literature in economics called new trade theory. So imagine like you live in a small town and like in the United States, I often use like upstate New York, right? But basically, it's like a lower population density area, right? And you have a large variety of very local goods, right? So in the United States and upstate New York, that would be like Polish sausage called kielbasa, right? Like everybody has this, right? Like in their local area, like the kind of food or whatever it is that's very unique to your area, right? So that they're producing that like very unique variety of sausage, but then as upstate New York becomes exposed to the broader markets in the United States and internationally, they start getting these supermarkets, which in the United States it's called Wegmans, or like these like big supermarkets, right? That sell like all sorts of stuff. And what those do is they drive out of business the people who are making kielbasa, right? This Polish sausage. But somewhat counterintuitively, the amount of choice for the people in upstate New York for what they want to consume goes up because now they can buy tacos, or they can buy Thai food, or they can buy, Chinese food. Whereas before, all they had was Polish sausage and like Italian, right? Or something like this,
Mhm.
right? And so that's the phenomena that's going on with the books as well. As the markets become, as your market access gets larger for a city, you're producing more variety, but it's a variety that matches the European average, not what your local one that used to be, right? And so that's the main thing, that we're finding, like in that it's a new trade theory result. Um, and what's been interesting to us with that paper is that according to the theory, new trade theory, there should be no growth impact for the city for this changing composition of what they're printing, because all the growth impact should be coming from the bump to market access that they initially got, not from the downstream change in the composition of what's being produced, right, with the books. But there are other theories in economics that say that this might not be true, right? So for example, if there are spillovers, like in terms of like knowledge creation and so forth, we would expect this. The Mokir story, right? Is that what you print actually matters. If you're printing useful knowledge, things like science, law, like to a certain extent, like trade journals, like, like how to convert money back and forth, that kind of thing. That's useful knowledge, as opposed to ceremonial knowledge, which is going to be, you know, poems, religious writings, that sort of thing. Um, that that's going to have an impact. According to Mokir, useful knowledge should be helpful for growth, whereas the ceremonial knowledge should not. And so when we break down the content across the titles into these two categories, we also find that the share of useful knowledge that's being printed in a city does predict some of their city growth going forward. And if they're printing more ceremonial, there's less of a growth impact. So so that paper is kind of cool, like partly because the embeddings is an interesting way of measuring things, in my opinion, but also this new trade theory result I think is fairly powerful. About what expanding markets did to the composition of knowledge at the city level, right? During this period of the printing press expanding. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Uh, my next question: does it matter what a city prints, or just how many books it produces?
So that I think I talked so much in the last answer to the question. I think I answered that one, right? So it did matter,
Mhm.
and it actually mattered whether you were printing. Well, it mattered depending on whether we're talking about vernacular or Latin. So in Europe, we make a distinction between uh, the lingua franca or Latin, which was used across all cities, like in Europe. So Latin was the language of the elites and of the knowledge like sphere as well, like science, for much of this period. And then vernacular slowly is being moved into the science side, and the elites, but not initially. And so in the vernacular, that is French, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, right? The there it's the share, like what proportion of the books you're printing are in useful versus uh versus not useful, that matters for your growth.
Uh-huh.
In Latin, it matters how what the variety of useful material is you're printing, which kind of makes sense, right? Like because the Latin is literally like for all of Europe, right? It's not for a local audience at all. It's being, if you print a Latin book in Paris, it could be aimed at Frankfurt, right? Like very easily. But if you're printing a French book, in Paris on science, it's very unlikely that somebody's going to buy it in Frankfurt, because they speak German, right? And so what mattered for Latin was the breadth of the useful knowledge you're printing. And that speaks to, basically the production process that's taking place within that city. Like, are you drawing in the chemist and the astronomers and the mathematicians, right? All like into this area, and they're like creating these synergies together.
Uh,
Whereas for the vernacular, it was just the proportion of the useful knowledge that mattered. That's a hard distinction to kind of convey, right? But that's the answer to your question. Yeah.
so back then, like Latin was like almost like English right now. Yeah, I guess.
Mm, yeah, except even more so. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Although I guess I should be careful. Maybe not more so because English maybe is a worldwide,
Mhm.
phenomena. But yeah, um, but Latin, it was, but yeah, but also with a with a slight caveat that English is spoken by both like elites and non-elites, across much of the world,
Mhm.
right? Whereas Latin was not the language at all of the non-elites. Like it was never something that a peasant would know. Like,
Uh-huh.
the peasant would know the vernacular. And to the extent that they could read, which was a small but growing proportion of the population that wasn't in like the universities or the church, like, the vernacular is what would matter for them. Latin was the language of the universities, the language of the church, and for a long time, the language of administration, like government
Mhm.
administration. Yeah.
God, thank you, Professor. Those were my all questions. So,
Okay.
but uh, I have one question like that is unrelated to economics. Like because
Okay.
I see this, a bunch of like a shelf, like I mean bookshelf, like filled with like Greek mythology, on
Uh-huh.
your back. So, and I want to ask, like, what do you think about Christopher Nolan's New Odyssey?
Oh, I haven't seen
Uh,
it. So
uh,
I very rarely get to go to movies in the movie theater, just because of my life choices. Like, like
uh,
I'm kind of busy, but yeah, so I can't speak to it. Um, I enjoyed Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey a great deal.
mhm,
I think she does very good, and I saw that she has a scathing review of Nolan's Odyssey, like in the London Review of Books, like like that just came out. But I'm going to read. I'm definitely going to see it, when I have an opportunity.
mhm.
But what did you think about it?
The thing is, like, I myself haven't watched it. Like, I want to
Yeah,
read book first. I want to read
yeah,
the books. Like, then I kind of
yeah.
want to watch it because, like, most of the time I do like that. Before watching something, I try to read the book, then kind of watch it because I kind of like the reading more than watching. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, good, good. Well, I highly recommend Emily Wilson's translation of it.
Mhm.
She did a great. I think she did a nice job. But I'm not a classicist, yeah, so that's just my amateur take. But
Uh,
thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
thank you for your time too. Like, thank you for like for your answers to your questions and to my questions. So I really do appreciate what you did for our community. So and good luck on your future research papers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And just let me know when this comes out. I'll be happy to distribute it for you as well. Okay.
Bye, Professor.
Okay. Bye bye. Thank you. Yep.